The following is a public preview of the New Models podcast. For our complete library, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com.
You're now listening to New Models.
Welcome to New Models. On this episode, we're joined by Jay Springett of the blog The JMO, a writer, researcher, consultant, musician, podcaster, Royal Society of Arts fellow, New Center instructor, decade-long admin of solarpunks.net, and to our recent discovery, a longtime listener and Discord member of New Models. Most recently, Jay has been theorizing worlds, a metaphorical term he extends to all of the designed collective environments that we inhabit daily, from Twitter to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As we discuss Jay's concepts of worlds and world running, he seems to deliberately fill our conversation with hyperlinks, authors, book titles, histories, and keywords that each open a door to further exploration. The result is an episode so full that it feels almost to be a world in itself. I'm Lil Internet, joined by my co-host Carly Busta. Our guest is Jay Springett. Let's get into it.
We are joined today by the JMO, aka Jay Springett. Jay, as a lot of your activity has transpired or at least been transmitted online, I decided to just ask Anthropic's Claude who you are. And this is the result I got. Jay Springett is a writer, consultant, and researcher known for his work on solarpunk, permacomputing, and related topics. He has written extensively about these subjects and their potential impacts on society and the environment. It goes on for a few more paragraphs, but how does that feel as a broad stroke intro?
It's funny that my association with solarpunk is such a big node in latent space connected to my name.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting. I guess that's a lifelong achievement now.
I guess we do talk about people's embeddings being the kind of truth that they are, but that's contingent on the kind of stuff that would end up online. And I guess something like solarpunk would have a pretty big footprint online. So that would make sense.
Yeah, I think so.
Of course, you also produce the podcasts Permanently Moved and Experience.computer, and you maintain a self-directed research project, which is stored as a work-in-progress living Google Doc called worldrunning.guide. And so we recently learned Jay is also a member of the New Models Discord. In any case, Jay, welcome to the show. It's truly a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks very much. It's like an interactive version of the podcast.
Well, as a way of beginning, we thought maybe we could just jump into this idea of world. The term world has a particular meaning in your work. When you use the word world, what do you mean? Let's get that working definition out there.
Yeah. I think it's important that people pick metaphors and stick with them when they're thinking about certain topics, and then see or try and process everything that's happening through the metaphor that they've decided to stick with. And the metaphor that I use is worlds, a metaphor for certain types of cultural and cognitive structures that have an inside and an outside and have certain rules, or at least a sense of coherency. The reason why I ended up thinking about worlds at all, apart from being like a tabletop war games and RPG nerd, is that I accidentally had a career after university working for a company that used to make psychometric tests, you know, like the personality tests that you do before you get a job or whatever. And through a series of acquisitions over the 6 or 7 years I was working there, ended up working at Gartner in the early teens. This was when it was called big data, you know, that era. So we would have all of this psychological profile data of people who had gone through tests as part of their yearly reviews. We had all of their data about their personal journey that they're on at work and all the scores that their other team members had given them, had all their sales data, all of their email information. The data team would basically try and combine all of this information and try and find something that was interesting to report back to the client. And one of the reports that we came up with, we're working with a really large organization. And let's just say in April, their top salespeople stopped selling stuff, just fell off a cliff. Their top performing salespeople were no longer good at their jobs. And we said, what happened in April? And they said, we got Slack. And it turned out that the salespeople were hardwired for gossip. And instead of doing their jobs, they spent all day wasting time on Slack internally rather than selling. And it was at that point I was like, oh, large corporations like this, it's just games design as a technosocial system. And that was like the aha moment.
That's just so ironic that Slack is called Slack and it just makes your salespeople just slack off at work. It's like you should have known.
What I'm interested in is if I hear the sort of first half of your definition, I think, of course, of an apparatus or a dispositif where there's an inside and an outside. It's held together by social and media systems, and it's self-contained. It's autonomous in a way. Yep. But when I hear you speak specifically about Slack, something else comes to mind. We're speaking not just philosophically, we're speaking tangibly. We're speaking tangibly about corporate platforms that have specific social protocols that then become some kind of fundamental system within the world. And I wonder how you might separate out this older idea of a dispositif or an apparatus. Like, how is a world more contemporary than these older analogies?
Yeah, I mean, we could also use cognitive assemblage from STS studies as well, right, as one of these words. Part of me wants to flippantly say that world is easier to talk about than a word like cognitive assemblage to people that have no interest in like any kind of academic jargon whatsoever. But I also think that worlds are the first new medium of this century, probably, and that it's interesting to think about that and what's happening and why it's happening, because it's the audience or the people that interact with these things as worlds, let's just say.
I wonder if you could just give us an example of the worlds you interact with on a normal day in the sense of how you're using the term. And then I think it'll be easy for people to link the word with the concept throughout this episode, since we'll be talking about it a lot.
Sure. So because of the expansive definition of the metaphor that I have, which is, again, an inside and an outside and a coherent internal logic, I apply the word world to all sorts of things that I'd interact with in my daily life. So like Twitter is a world, Slack is a world. Even within the program that we're using to record right now, you could say that that is its own self-contained world because there is a technical apparatus which is operating that we are socially talking to one another with. And then you have more, not necessarily discrete, but you have larger and larger worlds that you're embedded in. So you have to deal with like the financial world. We literally call it that, right? Or we call it the art world. There's also the historical terms like the Roman world or the classical world, etc. Then you have story worlds or fiction worlds. So fandoms are interested in the activities or the products of a fictional world that is being produced as well. I find that using such an expansive metaphor rather than saying something concrete actually allows you to see not necessarily trends, but where things are actually converging across all of these different kinds of media. And what is special about a world like a software world or a code space, let's say, because the management of something like the world of Marvel is actually very similar to the way that you have to manage all of the users inside of a code space or think about the audience that are inside of Twitter or a social network. Or at least you should be thinking about it in a similar way.
I wonder historically how this came into being. Is this more of a recent phenomenon that we think of these manifold worlds, nested worlds? I know on this podcast, we speak a lot about mass media being related to linear transmission of media. How do you see the evolution of worlds and worlds becoming, as you say, the medium of our time?
I can give you an exact date, which is 1972. And that is Dungeons and Dragons, which I think is probably the most important social technology of the 20th century because it allows people to collectively agree upon the events that happen inside of a completely abstract and imaginative system. But nevertheless, they can agree and coordinate and operate. And also there is a physics that happens inside this imaginary world, which allows everyone to agree on the outcome of actions that are taken within this imaginary world. And the thing that you have to think about is that the people who are playing D&D at MIT are the same people that first implemented COD's SQL database in the 1970s. So they already have this logic of computer systems and inventories and identities that you take with you into a system that you can interact with. But D&D is 1972. Colossal Cave Adventure, the first interactive fiction novel, is 1974. And then by 1978, you already have MUDs and multi-user dungeons. And you have, well, at the time, in its first iteration, 32 people hanging out in a virtual world. You know, it's so early. It's like within 4 years of Dungeons and Dragons, we have virtual worlds and people hanging out inside of them. And those logics are then applied to how we build multiplayer software in general.
One question. I don't have a very strong military history at all, and I really don't know the history of gaming other than, very superficially. But were there war games that were like tabletop war games that preceded it? I mean, I can just imagine like models being made, especially when the rules of engagement were much
there
narrower.
Absolutely were. I mean, of course,
Right.
You could say like chess is
Chess,
also
of course,
just a war game.
as you also say,
if
yeah,
you could
what's
draw
even-
out the distinction.
Right. What happened? How was D&D different than this prehistory of war games that would have been also virtual?
Yeah. So we're going to zoom right back, and we're also going to be in dialogue with James C. Scott, the author of Seeing Like a State, because this is kind of going to be the thesis of my book. We have played games of chance for as long as we have archaeological records. You know, the six-sided dice shows up in the archaeological record 6000 BC with opposing sides adding up to 7. It's fully formed, like as an object that we have in the archaeological record. We know that the Romans played kind of strategic games that involved dice towers and so on and so forth, as well as they loved games of chance. But the thing is, until the Enlightenment, we didn't actually understand probability or the mathematics of it. And it's this new understanding of probability that we get, which then gives rise to James C. Scott's legibility. Because if you can simulate the forest, then you can cut it down and replant the Prussian forestry and plant it in rows. So what happens in the Enlightenment is that you have this trend towards the legibility of things and building simulations of the forest in order to calculate, how many square board feet of wood there is in a forest. James C. Scott then takes that argument about legibility and reshaping the real world in order to better match the models that are produced by this kind of simulation. But exactly at the same time as James C. Scott's legibility is arising, you also get the development of the first war games, Das Kriegspiel, as it's known, which grows out of chess. But rather than using these new techniques of probability to simulate the real world, we simulate smaller worlds on a tabletop. And there's two routes that Kriegspiel takes from there. First of all, you get known as Kriegspiel or war game, which is kind of like a LARP for the military. And this became really popular in the 1800s and really influenced the Prussian military. And it's one of the reasons why they were considered one of the best militaries in the world at the time, because they were wargaming for training. Be like, what would you do in this situation? And then you would have to pretend that you're actually in that situation. And then the other history of that wargaming goes into tabletop wargaming and H.G. Wells, and you get the history of sci-fi and its relationship with simulation and imaginary worlds. So you have this history of war games that flows all the way through the 19th and 20th centuries into D&D in the 70s. But you also have two other histories that are important, and the first is role play or Rollenspieler from, I think it's Mornio or Monero is how you say his name. He's the founder of psychodrama, and he invents role play. And there's two histories of role play from psychodrama. One is the role play that we're all familiar with when you work in retail, which is I'll be the customer and we'll role play the interaction, which in the 1950s, role play was actually used in boardrooms in Shell, where they would be like role playing interactions with the union. And sometimes they would swap. So the unions would be the board and the board would be the unions, and they'd have to be negotiating. And all of this fell away during the neoliberal era, as you can imagine. But I think that's quite interesting. And the other history of role play goes into theatre, where you have Keith Johnston and Viola Spolin and improv. And then lastly, the third history that combines into Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s is obviously Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and essentially like proving out that you can create, or as Tolkien's word is, sub-create a believable world that is coherent. So Tolkien proves to the world that you can create these or sub-create these worlds, these fictional worlds that feel real and feel like they continue to exist after you've stepped away from the book. And all three of those things, roleplay, war games, and Tolkien, come together in Dungeons and Dragons to create something that's completely new, which is, if all worlds are models and all models are metaphors, what Dungeons and Dragons allows people to do in the 1970s is that for the first time, you can swoop down from the bird's eye view of a war game and you can go inside the simulation and have agency inside of it. And you can see how the idea that you go inside the simulation has a huge influence on the way that people think about software. Because it was mainframes back then, right? So everyone's sitting at the terminal. But everyone who is writing code and thinking about these things are all playing Dungeons and Dragons. And they understand that you can go inside a simulation and have agency and affect change, et cetera, et cetera. And those three things coming together in Dungeons and Dragons then gives rise to this new way of seeing systems, because before you would have called it cybernetics, right? Which doesn't necessarily afford the people inside the systems with agency. It's more about the control of the system. Whereas with Dungeons and Dragons, you're inside of the system and within reason, you have agency within inside the simulation or the world that you're playing inside of, which has taken a generation and a half, essentially, or 2 generations for people to actually start thinking about systems in the way that Dungeons and Dragons suggests, like this new way of seeing the world or going inside the metaphor. And so you have this generational shift, maybe, that is, we're more and more comfortable with thinking about being inside of a system. And of course, the other thing that Dungeons and Dragons does is that for the first time, a system produces narrative, which is not something that has ever happened before. No one would have thought that a system would be generating a narrative until Dungeons and Dragons. So that also has an impact on how we understand systems or worlds when we're inside of them, because events happen and then we interpret them narratively.
I mean, I want to play devil's advocate here, but not to contradict, more just to like add another dimension. I do think about pre-Enlightenment understandings of spiritual worlds, whether that's Christian or Islamic or Buddhist. And I think about, well, especially for something like Buddhism, where you don't have a sense of time, which is linear. So the deities that you're engaging with coexist with you in that sense. And so I do wonder, in a way, those are systems that have certain protocols and rules that are collectively agreed upon. When you believe you sin, you go and you speak to whatever elder in your religious order to absolve yourself of the sin. There are consequences that you then believe. Maybe I'm forcing this, but I wonder if in any of your research or your thinking, if you do see some kind of desublimated spiritual or religious human impulses.
It's interesting because in most of the academic literature, the use of the word worldview is almost exclusively applied in religious contexts. So you have a Christian worldview or a Jewish worldview. And then, there's discussions about politics from the Christian worldview. And one of the things that I talk about is that if you start to see other types of systems as worlds, it means that you start to adopt worldviews when you go inside of them. And in order to be able to navigate and operate within those worlds, you have to understand the worldview that you're inside of. So like Twitter has a certain worldview, right? And I don't mean this in a kind of political or social sense, but the worldview of Twitter is whatever it is, 260 characters, small text box, short thoughts, reply, please see this, pass it on, I have more, is basically the rules of Twitter.
Interesting. No, that's perfect. And then you think of something like Romelia, the terms of engagement, it's like another worldview within the worldview of Twitter. Anyway, that's an interesting framework. Once we think of it as a worldview, we can then think of our relationship to that worldview as a way of having agency within a certain logic.
So Dungeons and Dragons is also considered a game. I mean, we've been talking about games a lot here, and many definitions of games include their voluntary nature as an essential part of what makes a game a game. But today there's a lot of systems we engage with that may look like a game and that we play like a game, but for which there's kind of a strong disincentive to not play. I mean, if you're like a cultural producer,
you have a strong incentive to play the game.
Right.
You have to, because otherwise you're not visible.
Well, it essentially brings the voluntariness of these into question. Is this part of the reason you talk about worlds as different from games? How does your idea of worlds and the idea of games relate, intersect, overlap, or?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. One of the things is that in game studies itself, it's really hard to pin down what a game is. Huysmans spends an entire book talking about it with Homo Ludens, and then comes to the conclusion that it's really hard to define what a game is, basically. And then Wittgenstein, he says that the only thing you can say about games is that they resemble each other. Like certain kinds of games have certain kind of characteristics that overlap. But as you go down the line, comparing 2 or 3 games in a row, the first game may seem nothing like the third game. I think about James P. Cars's finite and infinite games quite a bit, but he generally talks about games being voluntary, and that infinite games are voluntary because they're the kind of games which the game continues if the player plays the game. So it's kind of a mutually beneficial flourishing that you have when you're playing an infinite game. And the finite game obviously has an end state or a win condition. And I would say that worlds, when you think about them, are usually systems or narrative structures that have no win condition. There's no endpoint. So there's kind of a difference between the two. There is no win condition for Lord of the Rings or for Marvel's MCU. In fact, economically, it behooves the people who own these properties and who are running these worlds to continue the worlds for as long as possible, including encouraging the energy from the audiences to perpetuate the worlds. Yeah, so that's kind of how I see the difference between the two. Not all games require a win condition, but many do. And worlds don't necessarily require a win condition. Instead, worlds tend to have possibility spaces.
So in this case, you're talking about mostly voluntary games, but it seems like sometimes games are involuntary. Maybe we have the choice of entering it, but there's a strong disincentive to not enter. So we have to play it, even though we may not like its physics and we don't like what it produces. I know
capitalism is an involuntary game.
For instance, exactly.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on involuntary games?
Cast doesn't necessarily talk about involuntary games in finite and infinite games, but he does recognize that, especially with finite games, that there are things like social roles and expectations, power dynamics, cultural and historical scripts that you kind of have to follow in order to achieve some end state, whether its number goes up or whatever it is culturally. But it maybe I hang out with Benedict Singleton too much, but involuntary games are essentially traps. An involuntary game is a trap that you can't get out of, essentially, that you're forced to play or forced to continue to play because there is no exit.
Although if we think of the analogy of, say, being on Instagram if you're in fashion, however little agency you have over the algorithmic channels that it sends you down, you still kind of have to be on Instagram because it's a kind of comment. That said, one can imagine a scenario where you engage with Instagram, but then it allows you to have exchanges out of world or out of game, which are beneficial. Exchanges that you wouldn't have if you didn't spend any time looking at it. Like, for instance, you'll find out that there is some special event happening and you go and it's the facilitator of something out of game. I mean, I'm thinking also of Shannon's mouse, which I know you've spoken about on your podcast before, and the idea of the maze solving the mouse. And if you can be a mouse that's not seeking the cheese, but just kind of like chilling in the maze, what is the strategy of engaging in these involuntary games without falling into the trap?
In some sense, I think it's probably easy to say that social media has been designed as a trap. But just in general, you understand the worldview that you have to adopt when you're on Instagram. And so you just have to interact with the world and then leave because you can leave, It's like, it's basically just a touch grass meme, right? You don't have to spend all your time there.
I also think about finding a way to exert agency in a way that the game is not necessarily designed for. I always think about Creation telling us that she held church services in GTA Online. That's like a space of unanticipated agency in a game, even if it is a trap.
For better or worse, these games are our commons. We do have, of course, like local networks where you see people in your neighborhood and there are bars. These things exist. They're not going away. But increasingly, we have digital locals. And these mass games like social media are a kind of commons. And I have to find some way of dealing with them. I always put this disclaimer that probably to a fault, we articulate generational lines, but I do think that there are certain habits which generations have based on...
Well, they grew up in different media environments.
Exactly, based on the media environment. And if there is any truth to generations, I think a generation's relationship to the default media of that age is somewhat valid. And something that came up when we were speaking with LB Dobis, the editor of Romelia Quarterly last week, was how easy and natural online role-playing tends to be for Zoomers. Like for them, there's not really a difference between LARPing and really doing something, whereas millennials and older generations often get hung up on seeming inauthentic or appearing to be posers. And this, of course, is like the people who are involved in MUDs and early BBS boards notwithstanding. Obviously, they've been able to fluidly transition between their IRL selves and taking on different identities online. But for most people, the ethos of esse quam videri, to be and not to seem, was so strongly instilled in general premillennial culture that there is still this anxiety. So how might this fundamental difference in the approach to LARPing or the approach to authenticity fit into your concept of world running? And maybe you could spend a moment also identifying like what is world running. It's a great term.
As worlds become increasingly more prevalent or understood as a medium with which people are working, the people who have their hands at the levers of systems or certain kinds of media, the question becomes, how do you run them and how do you keep these worlds, to use Ian Cheng's term, worlding, right? Like, how do you keep the world going is kind of more important than what the world is in and of itself. Like, we don't necessarily have a playbook for this kind of new interactive or participatory media that people identify with and also produce media for. Like, there's a lot of stuff from the 90s, media theorists around transmedia, like Henry Jenkins, who are kind of all pointing towards that this is going to be a thing. But now here we are 30 years later, where worlds as a medium are certainly a thing. And I think you're right about the generational thing, because as millennials, we all got online and then began constructing identities for ourselves through, like you said, that Gen X logic of not selling out or being a poser. And yet, at least my teenage years was completely defined about the way that you dressed was who you were. Like, they actually said something about you, which is no longer the case. And I think that I'm probably going to make the argument, actually, that Zoomers feel...
If you're hearing this message, you've completed the first step towards becoming a New Models member. To continue, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com. A complete library containing hundreds of rare New Models episodes awaits.